So with the new edition of Warhammer 40k, it seems that Games Workshop is making a concerted effort to perhaps emulate or push back a bit on some of the companies that are making supporting or alternative rule systems for their games. Perhaps Games Workshop is deciding to go down the route of if you can't beat them, then join them. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today I thought I'd just share a couple of thoughts as to Games Workshop's general offering with the 10th edition release, and how to some extent they seem to be emulating other companies that make cheap or free rules for their games, either better processing Games Workshops or making their own systems. The main three that I thought I'd focus on in this one are Wahapedia, Battlescribe, and one-page rules, and with the 10th edition release it does seem that Games Workshop is taking a leaf out of all three of their books. I'd argue that in particular these three all make Warhammer 40k better in their own different ways. Certainly I suspect that not everyone here uses all three of those, or might have even heard of them all, but they all have pretty good rep. Wahapedia fills the niche of actually making Warhammer 40k's rules accessible to the masses, and also far easier to parse than Games Workshop's offering in their codex or their app. It's a browser-based website indexing all of 40k's current rules and datasheets, putting them all together for ease of access, and also basically removes the paywall of Warhammer 40k by making them free to access for those who don't have a codex, probably much to Games Workshop's annoyance. In my experience, certainly the majority of people who tend to use it find it a better way to reference 40k rules than Games Workshop themselves currently make. Things like points on the datasheets are particularly handy. Then we've got Battlescribe, the app that basically makes Warhammer 40k list building easier to do than Games Workshop themselves can manage. Again, this can be a source of lots of the most common Warhammer 40k rules, easily available as you build your army. It's maintained by a team of volunteers, has multiple options for outputting an army, and is generally considered far superior to Games Workshop's own app offering that they made for 9th edition. Again, it's a tool that makes 40k gaming just that bit easier. Finally, and perhaps a bit of a different offering, is one-page rules Grimdark Future, though I guess it could apply to other miniature agnostic wargames as well. I'd consider them the first choice that most people tend to turn to if you're looking for a different rule system for Warhammer 40k and you want to play with the same models. They're basically a rival wargame with vastly simpler and easier access for a rule set, certainly something that's been in demand for a whole bunch of people throughout the complexities of 9th. I feel like whenever you talk about Games Workshop's rules complexity, you'll get a fair few people throwing in a good word for them as a different miniature gaming system that you can try for a bit more of a streamlined experience that still works fine with the models. Overall, basically all of those three are different ways that you can play games with Games Workshop's models if you want, and I feel like their popularity perhaps shows hobbyist demand and kind of market forces rewarding the people that fill that demand, either by financial reward or just hobby rep more in the case of Battlescribe. I feel like each of the three perhaps highlight a failing or oversight of Games Workshop, and they're offering something that they don't from the core Warhammer 40k experience, often considered to be beating the in-house offering for rule support, list building, and a simplified gaming experience, often to the extent that these tended to start as passion projects, but then gained more and more traction. For Games Workshop though, while they might not be necessarily harmful, and for a lot of people they tend to make Warhammer 40k a bit more playable, arguably being an asset to Games Workshop rather than a liability. However, GW really don't want to entrust another company with a whole load of power over their own gaming system. It's just probably a bad idea in the long run for them. Say for example, if Wahapedia or Battlescribe were to suddenly shut down for factors outside of their control, I don't think they'd want that to be a chance to make Warhammer 40k a worse gaming experience, just because they haven't bothered to create those sort of facilities themselves. All of these are kind of loose competition as well with Games Workshop. Kind of shows they don't own the entire value of Warhammer games, even if they own the IP and make the rules. In general though, I feel like a bit of friendly competition is probably good for us as hobbyists. Other folks improving and innovating kind of drives improvement from Games Workshop, and it might be a good thing for collectors overall. In terms of how they can respond to this though, I think like Games Workshop do have a fair amount of options. Ignoring them and just letting them be maybe isn't the worst thing in the world, but they probably don't want them to get exponentially bigger to the extent where they could jeopardize the game system if they start doing weird things. They probably don't want to be gradually eroding their own control over their product as well. Otherwise, they can potentially make use of their legal team, which they certainly have in the past. Certainly Warhapedia's borne the brunt of that kind of attention. They got sent a cease and desist, and they had their Patreon page taken out, but they seem to be doing pretty well anyway, basically beyond Games Workshop's reach, in a country that doesn't really care too much about copyright infringement. Otherwise, Battlescribe, I believe, is more or less safe due to the way that the data is uploaded for it. If the data creators aren't charging money for it and are just sharing game rules, I don't think that there's anything that Games Workshop can do. And there's not much that they can do about rival war games unless they started just literally making things that actually infringed on Games Workshop's IP, rather than just races and settings that feel kind of the same but not quite exactly analogous. Then I guess you have the option of actually partnering with them. I feel like a lot of people often say that Games Workshop should just hire some of these people. I guess that's essentially what they did with some of the animators and things with their whole Warhammer Plus launch, though there was perhaps a bit of a carrot and stick there between that and basically telling them that they're infringing on their IP. They do partner with tournaments and event organisers as well, so it's maybe not entirely unheard of, but maybe it's just something that they don't really want to do, as it's basically designing their main product, as opposed to partnering with people who are just enjoying their hobby. Otherwise, though, if Games Workshop do want to expand and take back these areas a little bit, then perhaps the easiest way is just to try and be better than them, be equal or outcompete them, which at least on paper maybe shouldn't be too hard to do. They are a company with an enormous amount of resources at their disposal. They don't even necessarily need to be better than these other folks. Lots of people are into Warhammer just for the painting, modelling and lore. Provided Games Workshop's gaming experiences are at least equal to other players, people won't just really have all that much incentive to go and seek out these other companies. And in general, that would typically mean improving their offering and product, maybe offering more things for free, and perhaps sacrificing a little bit of short-term profits for a bit more long-term control, and perhaps growing and expanding the hobby in the meantime. I'd argue that from their initial previews of 10th edition, they do seem to be going down this kind of route. Seems like Games Workshop is making an effort to push back on all three of these providers, at least on some fronts, though how successful they'll be is another question. It certainly seems that towards the tail end of 9th edition, Games Workshop as a company have been trying to get people a bit more on side, maybe setting the groundwork for the 10th edition launch and trying to expand the amount of people who are playing Warhammer in general. Moves that they've made recently are making points cost digital and free, rather than having to buy a chapter approved book every 6 months and go down big tables of listings. They responded to community pressure and stopped putting match play rules and supplements, expensive books that you might only want 1 or 2 pages of rules for, and I feel like this may be one on a whole bunch of different levels, reducing rules bloat, the books needed to play, and game complexity in one. Towards the tail end of 9th edition, game balance in general has generally been a whole ton better. For the first half of the edition, it was all about the next codex basically wins, and it was turning a whole bunch of people off the hobby. They eventually realised that, and now actually implemented some genuinely quite reasonable balance changes between their data slates and points updates. I'd perhaps argue that even their latest price rises were a little bit below inflation. Still obviously very painful, and it's not like wages are keeping up with inflation or anything like that, but given that Warhammer's often been increasing far above inflation in the past, showing just a tiny bit of restraint is probably not the worst idea when people's budgets are strapped. 10th edition perhaps seems set to go further though, improving their game's offering to compete with these other players a bit. First up for Wahapedia, they offer free easy access datasheets, points and codex rules for the entire game, all incredibly accurate and well maintained, plus a whole bunch of other useful features as well. Points on datasheets, really easy to jump between different units, search features, and a bunch of other clever reference things built in. Perhaps to try and compete with them a bit, Games Workshop has now promised free downloadable datasheets for every faction in the game right from launch of 10th. It sounds like you'll now no longer need to go to a third-party rule site to check out the official rules for another faction that you might not own the codex book for. Supposedly for the launch at least as well, the indexed attachment rules, points cost pages, and the core rules of the game will all also be free, downloadable, and online. That's what they've been saying so far at least. Hopefully they actually deliver on it and don't go halfway. Between all of that, I can't help but think that Wahapedia might be a little bit diminished in terms of market share. Perhaps just a tiny bit less essential if there's an official source offering all the factions' rules, plus the need for super efficient referencing systems might just be a little bit diminished if Games Workshop makes the rules significantly more simple. In general though, I still find it kind of hard to imagine that Games Workshop will actually make a system that's better than Warhapedia's. For example, it doesn't look like the points are going to be on the datasheets and automatically updated or anything like that. They'll probably be on a separate army construction document. Plus the ease and searchability of being on a web browser I think is going to be a big advantage over anything that Games Workshop comes up with. Whether or not it's downloadable PDFs or some sort of elaborate app system, I just can't see it being quite as easy to use. Still though, an official source catching up really quite a lot compared with where they are at the moment I think will be welcomed by quite a few. So I suppose Games Workshop might put themselves back to square one a little bit more if they release expensive codexes, again maybe with just one detachment rules that you need in them. If those aren't downloadable and free, I feel like a lot of people are just going to be using Wahapedia for them anyway. Moving on to Battlescribe, and between the core app and the people who make the 40k data for it, they've basically got an army builder that's far better than anything the Games Workshop can offer for 9th edition. Games Workshop's 10th edition launch promise is that they're going to have rules and an army builder in an updated app all the way from day one. And if they do manage that, then that will be a lot better than what they had before. Prior to 9th edition, they didn't really have anything that worked even halfway as an army builder at all. And then when 9th edition came out, they basically promised a Warhammer 40k app. It turned out to be just ridiculously bare bones at the start, and the army builder was only added a good few months later. And then when it did finally come about, it was missing a whole bunch of major sections, things that you might need to add to your army, like say orc custom jobs and things like that. Lots of units just didn't really work in the first place with war gear and things, all manner of points costs were wrong, and it was a bit of a disastrous launch as far as it went. Then if you did even want to find out the rules for things, even if you paid for a subscription for the app, you'd still need to buy codexes and input a code into it. So even if the bugs and things weren't the biggest problem, you were still getting a few less rules for a few fewer factions. They gave you some basic rules and stat lines, but didn't go into detail without the codex code. I guess it remains to be seen whether this time will be different or not. I'd imagine that just from familiarity it would take a very, very long time for the majority of the community to shift away from Battlescribe, even if GW's core offering is equally good, which I think at this point is definitely not guaranteed, and even if it is, it might cost a whole bunch more. In general, whether they manage to compete with it well or not will depend on how good their core offering is. Certainly if they can get it running and adequate from day one, then it will really help with its adoption. They have the chance to get themselves ahead of the game there, and I feel like in 10th edition they're going to have a much easier job building an army builder for it. There's just so many things in 9th edition that they just don't have to worry about with this one. Army construction is massively simple. Lots of weird army specific upgrades are basically going to get removed wholesale. Replacing sub-factions with detachments is going to be a big deal, and I suspect that we're probably getting a whole load more free war gear with 10th edition going down the trend of 9th. I certainly expect Games Workshop's army builder to be massively better than the 9th edition one, though I guess only time will tell on that front. Finally, and I will admit in a bit of a different vein, with the one-page rules Grimdark Future, I admit I'm far less familiar with the system, so if I make any major errors, please let us know down in the comments, but in general what I've heard tends to be fairly good. To my understanding, they basically tend to be a miniature agnostic war game with a super slimmed down rule set. The core rules of the game literally just fit on one page, and then there's one for universal special rules, and then a whole bunch of other bits for the various different units and different factions. They do offer their own 3D printed miniature designs, though if you do take a look through their rule sets, there's an awful lot of units that map really quite closely with Games Workshop's model offerings. Say for example for their dwarf guilds, they've got options to arm them with axes, hammers, or dual gauntlets, all of which are options on Games Workshop's models. For the most part, it's pretty popular as an alternative to 40k for far less of a steep learning curve, very quick and easy to get up with and going with a game with, and lots less to keep track of when you're actually in a game. Just while making videos on the channel, I feel like I've heard an awful lot of anecdotes of people dropping 40k to play this slimmed down rule set, and it really does seem that Games Workshop was cottoned on to this, that 9th edition was a bit too complex and bloated, having a bit of a tagline of being streamlined but not simple as one of their main selling points for 10th edition 40k. It's kind of interesting that they're making quite a lot of a big deal about all the faction rules being on one page, the idea being that you're not flipping through multiple different pages or different books and supplements. All the unit profiles are on handy data cards, so you can just bring them along and have them to hand for the units that you actually need, not every single one that your faction has access to that you might not own. And the redesigned core rules look a lot handier as well. Sounds like a fair few mechanics have basically just been cut out, and a whole bunch of common rules have been streamlined with a table of universal special rules, which is likely to make gameplay a bit smoother for people who aren't familiar with every faction. Overall, I'd argue that perhaps Games Workshop is wanting to narrow the gap between this and other similar offerings. I feel like you wouldn't really meet many people who said that 9th edition 40k had too few rules in it. Seems like community opinion is very much that they've gone too far one way and they need to swing the balance back a bit. These guys are basically a rival war game, and I'm sure we'll be doing basically fine regardless of what Games Workshop does. I'd guess though that we might well find a few less people evangelising them on 40k sites. It does rather seem like Games Workshop is going down the same sort of core selling model, just being very easy to get into and far more straightforward to play than before. In general, I just kind of found it interesting that it looks like Games Workshop is trying to do a bit of pushing back and emulating on all these other creators at a similar sort of time. It does really look like their aim with 10th edition is to reduce as many barriers to player entry to the hobby as they possibly can. And perhaps the easiest ways for them doing that is to improve on the areas that they're arguably doing so badly that other people are stepping in to fill the gaps. I'll be interested to hear your guys' thoughts though. What do you make of the new ways that Games Workshop's innovating and expanding? And do you think the usage of these other players will increase or decrease after Games Workshop release their new edition? If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more like this, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the Warhammer 40k things coming just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you'd like to help support more videos. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.